Thanks everybody for joining us today for the Kirby Institute seminar series. My name is Eloise and I'm a senior lecturer at the Kirby Institute. I'll be chairing today's seminar. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And today I'm presenting from the land of the Cammeraygal people. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. And a couple of housekeeping rules to start off with. The format of this seminar, we have two excellent presenters, and so I'll share an introduction of both presenters first, and they'll follow with their presentations, and we'll follow that with a Q&A at the very end. And for those who haven't joined this format before, to ask a question, you click on the icon with the speech bubble and the question mark at the top right corner to open up the Q&A chat panel. And then you can enter your question there as an ask a question. And if you can remember to write your name, that's very helpful for us to reference your question and making it easier to answer. So let's get underway, and I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Eloise Brook. She's a writer, advocate and academic, and she's the Health and Communications Manager for New South Wales peak transgender organisation, the Gender Centre. Her work includes developing ways to empower the trans community to engage with the Australian media in more positive ways. She's a researcher and lecturer in political science and gender studies. She's the host and producer of the Gender Centre's podcast, Counting the Dead. Eloise was a member of the reference group for the Australian Bureau of Statistics Standards for Sex, Gender, Variations of Sex Characteristics and Sexual Orientation Variables. Our second speaker today is Dr. Bridget Haire, who's also a senior research fellow at the Kirby Institute. She conducts research in the areas of research ethics, public health and human rights, particularly with regard to HIV and other bloodborne infections, sexual health and emerging infectious diseases. Bridget was also a member of the reference group for the Australian Bureau of Statistics Standard for Sex, Gender, Variations of Sex Characteristics and Sexual Orientation Variables. So I'd like everybody to welcome our two presenters, and Eloise, I think you're going to start us off. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Louise. So yes, welcome today, and I think I'd like to start off by talking a little bit about the context about the ABS's work and around inclusivity and data, because there is an interesting history that really informs some of the decisions, or a lot of the decisions that have been made that go into this. And first of all, I wanted to kind of point out something that is evident within the trans and gender diverse community, and that is in Australia, discrimination or forms of discrimination that are most apparent to the lived experience of trans people comes about because of systemic and bureaucratic inconsistencies and injustices. So often we see stuff happening overseas. We see very serious types of discrimination that affect the trans community internationally. But in Australia, the very specific or the day-to-day experiences that trans people kind of live through or have to deal with are frequently grounded in the inability to be able to fill in a form or to have data collected about them in meaningful ways, to kind of be pushed into, I guess, an invisible space. The knock-on effect of that invisibility I'll talk about through the next slide, but effectively the ABS standard and the process that the journey that we have been on towards a more reasonable or purposeful kind of standard it's taken a couple of years, and it's gone through some interesting and somewhat kind of head scratching changes along the way. In the 2016 census, the data collection around that was I think the word comical is probably an appropriate term. At the conclusion of the 2016 census, which moved a lot of the data collection online, the ACON reported that they had just over 1,200 trans and gender diverse people who filled in the survey, who identified themselves as being trans and gender diverse. At the time and now, as with any kind of data collection and survey instruments with vulnerable and at-risk communities, the collection of information and the trust that's generated towards that collection is incredibly important. And 2016, despite lots of work from lots of advocates and advocacy groups, highlighted some of the profound problems that we had in trying to get people to understand the importance of collecting data and the importance of collecting that data in inclusive ways. The trans and gender diverse community has or is notorious for just simply not turning up to be included in things that they don't feel is empowering. So we might turn over to the next slide, thank you. So here we have what looks like pretty much a standard piece of information gathering to do with the community. And here we see straight away what everyone assumes to be very standard, the idea that we have a gender, male and female. Now, as the trans and gender diverse community and the intersex community too, but to a degree that Bridget will talk about going forward, the importance of overcoming invisibility towards the improvement of health services, the collection of data to kind of understand what is happening out there in the world is crucial. So when faced with the option of a standard yes, male or female kind of box on a form like this, trans and gender diverse people and intersex people too, but trans and gender diverse people are frequently faced with a conundrum about how they articulate or make sense of who they are in terms of these kinds of forms. Because either the forms don't get filled out or they get left, or sometimes trans people write things in, or you tick the box that most applies to you, or perhaps you might even tick the box that is your gender or sex at birth. And this kind of information gathering essentially makes the trans community invisible, or numbers around trans people to be meaningless. Next slide, please. So the male and female indicators are binary and simplistic. They don't capture the diversity of trans identities in any kind of meaningful way. And this is harmful because again, the idea that data isn't being adequately collected. Now, a good example about this, or a parallel that just to kind of make people aware, is that at the Gender Centre, we're currently having ongoing discussions about adequate funding towards essential services towards some of the most vulnerable section of our community, which happens to be kids and families. And we know mental health problems that occur in the community are very, very serious. And because of inadequate data collection, or because there's no way of understanding or getting a sense of the community, we know that a lot of the community and the younger people are finding themselves in mental health services or in emergency departments, or accessing incredibly unnecessary and or expensive for the taxpayer services. Because there's not that information, and because there's been a reluctance to capture that information in a meaningful way, we get this kind of services that are available, are accessed, but they aren't always the best, or they're frequently not the best kinds of services for these particular communities. They end up costing an incredible amount of money for the taxpayers, and they don't do the work that they really need to for the community. So the importance of capturing or understanding the identities, or the multiple kind of the non-binary identities of the community, to get a sense along who and how the community is kind of moving what their particular needs are in the way that we capture this information is very, very, very important. And then also the idea of respectful inclusion, you know, of the intersex community, the transgender diverse community, and they all lead to lifelong kind of health problems and all sorts of kind of ongoing kind of concerns when you have a community of people who are effectively left on the outside. So next slide, please. So here we have an indication, an example of how we go about coming up with the kinds of terms that indicate a person's gender, usually female, also male, and more recently terms like non-binary are also included as well. But this kind of data, or this kinds of information, as I mentioned, doesn't kind of adequately capture it. Could you turn to the next slide, please? And the next slide, please, sorry. So the need for the standards to be really clear are incredibly important. And so there was a lot of initial work to meet and discuss with the communities about what the particular needs of those communities were, that the ABS worked with, among other organisations, including Intersex Human Rights, the Gender Centre, and the LGBTI Health Alliance, and ACON, as well as a lot of others. And a lot of this work has been done in the past and continues to kind of be done as well. The collection of the documentations, what was particularly necessary, kind of informed the kinds of decision-making processes that were really key towards the best way to capture this, to capture the data. Next slide, please. So the new ABS standards, or the standards that were discussed or came together, really focused on, or kind of returned to, some kind of essential standards. For instance, sex, gender, variation of sex characteristics, but also there was further discussions around sexual orientation as well. So these kinds of elements, or these ideas, formed an intersection of the different kinds of identities and senses of how gender and identity fit in with data collection. Next slide, please. So the ABS standard uses 2 questions to establish sex and gender, and a further question regarding variations of sexual characteristics, which, thank you. So here we go. First question was essentially, what was your sex recorded at birth? And here we have the typical box to tick for male, or the typical box to tick for female. But in it, there was included a third option, which was another term. Next slide, please. So sex recorded at birth refers to what was the determining sex characteristics that was observed at infancy upon the child. And it remains an important statistical aspect of all data collection across various kinds of groups for various kinds of reasons, in both kind of getting a sense of the cis and the trans population. Next slide, please. So the next variable that was introduced, or that was really important, was the notion or idea of introducing gender. So how do you as a person describe your gender? And in this instance, you can see how the initial question about sex characteristics creates or is transposed with or compared with the idea of a lived experience of what gender is. Here we have 5 options. The first one is, of course, first 2, the gender of male or female, a third non-binary option as well, and then usually a different term, or how you might use a different term, and a fifth option, which is obviously prefer not to answer. So these two kind of data points combined together help to give a much more nuanced idea of the community, or a community, the transgender diverse community and intersex, but in this case, helps to give a much better idea about the types of variations or gradations amongst gender identity. It helps to kind of collect information, or some of the more even basic information. I think, next slide please. I think at this point, the most important thing, considering the historical nature of the data collection around this, is that to go from having no data whatsoever, or as I mentioned, 1,200 trans people in Australia, to getting kind of any kind of data, or data that is gives even a starting point to be able to understand what the community looks like out there. I know that in checking or kind of understanding the data, the general kind of ABS data and the collection points, the comparison between existing or ongoing surveys that have been done over and over already give us a sense of the types of identities, and maybe even the size, or an indication of the size of the population to a certain degree. But it's not until we get that overall ABS data that gives us a much better or much clearer idea of how those studies that we have done, or that we have access to, how it fits into an overall or kind of wider perspective. So some of the questions that we need to ask about: why was there not, say, for instance, a trans option? And I think specifically one of the things that you experience when working with the trans and gender diverse community and in data collection is that there is that people and the community is reluctant to identify along very kind of set ways. There is a sense of multiple kind of options, or multiple kind of senses of who or how you would define yourself. We know from one of the Kirby's studies from 2019, one of the very interesting information that came out was that, especially amongst young people and people who identify towards non-binary, that in certain circumstances you might use different terms to describe yourself. So, for instance, if you might be with your close circle of friends, where you feel that you can trust them, and you might describe yourself as being a non-binary person. If you need to go to the doctors, maybe your local doctors, or someone that you trust reasonably, you might also need to gauge the level of understanding that person has. So perhaps you might just describe yourself as being transgender, or something that is going to remove the hurdles towards accessing health. You might end up, for some reason, in emergency, and in that circumstance, for your own safety and for your sense of how best to access health services, you might call yourself female, or if you might call yourself or identify along your gender assigned at birth. So these kinds of different gradations of describing oneself in the trans community isn't just about getting out of bed one day and deciding that you're going to present as one or the other. They actually have real world consequences about how you navigate discrimination within the health system. So it's really important, to remember or keep in mind. That's why terms like trans or non-binary are all elusive kind of terms that need to be captured, but aren't necessarily a fixed point that you can pin down. Next slide, please. And I think I think I've kind of spoken to some degree about how sex and gender interrelate in this kind of circumstance. So how sex and gender interrelate in the terms of the kinds of data that's being captured around the trans and gender diverse community, in terms of getting a sense of how or where to use descriptors, how to navigate the system to achieve or to get the best kind of outcomes for your health. So I might now hand over to Bridget.
Thanks so much, Eloise. So I'm now talking about the third variable. So we've talked about sex and gender. The third one is variation of sex characteristics. And what this is intended to capture is people who obviously were born with a variation of sex characteristics, which is sometimes called intersex. And intersex is an acceptable term to people who are intersex, or DSD, which stands for differences of sexual development. In medical terminology, sometimes that used to be defined as disorders of sexual development, and that is an offensive term, but differences is not an offensive term. And so DSD can be an acceptable label for people as long as that first D is being differences and not disorders, because intersex is not a negative health condition. It's just a variation of being, of biological being, if you like. So this is again a mandatory requirement in the standard, that if you are asking about variation of sex characteristics, that you do it in this way, that you give people a yes, no, don't know, or prefer not to answer option. So for people who aren't familiar with the concept of variations of sex characteristics, refers to people who've got an innate genetic, hormonal or physical sex characteristics that don't conform to medical norms. So they don't precisely fit norms that have been established for female or male bodies. And it does refer to a wide range of variations in terms of genitals, hormones, chromosomes and or reproductive organs. Now, intersex or variations of sex characteristics don't always occur, they're not always noticed at birth. Some of them become apparent at puberty or later, even possibly in adulthood, if somebody is having investigations to find out about infertility, for example. That can be another place where people find variations of sex characteristics. And so I've covered this, that these are different terms that are used, and we don't use the term disorders of sex development because, again, that's implying that there's something wrong or something pathogenic about this state, and it's not a pathogenic state. The problem is we don't actually know, again, about the numbers of people who are living with differences of sex development because the right questions haven't been asked. And if I can hark back to what Eloise was talking about earlier, about the census, the 2016 census, which asked some unfortunate questions, unfortunately the 2021 census is also going to ask some unfortunate questions, in that it's going to ask about non-binary sex as distinct from non-binary gender. And possibly people who formulated that question thought that they were going to identify intersex people by that, or possibly they thought they were going to identify trans and gender diverse people. Unfortunately, it's just simply the wrong question. It doesn't fit in with how people actually identify. An estimated 2% of people have intersex characteristics, so it's not that uncommon. In fact, it has been referred to as being similar to the rate of people in the population who have red hair. So it's an interesting way of thinking about it. Intersex variations include, there's a list of things here: androgen insensitivity, XX congenital adrenal hyperplasia, 5-alpha reductase deficiency, and gonadal dysgenesis. But if you want to read more about what intersex is, I would really urge you to look up the Intersex Human Rights Association, Intersex Human Rights Australia, which is the peak body that represents intersex people and talks about intersex in a really holistic way. So not just in terms of the various different biologies of being an intersex person, but the legal issues that can stem from this, and also talks about the way that people identify. So people who are living with variations of sex characteristics are no more likely than people who are not, for example, to identify as being non-binary. Usually people with intersex characteristics identify as a particular gender. And so it's important to understand that people who are living with these biological differences don't necessarily see themselves as being some kind of non-binary gender category. I'm now going to move on to variable 4, which is sexual orientation. And again, this is the question that comes from the standard. They give you the options of being straight or heterosexual, gay or lesbian, and presumably because they've already worked out your gender, they're going to be able to tell which one you are, whether it's gay or lesbian, if you answer that question. Bisexual, and again, three other options at the end. I use a different term, please specify. So that's actually providing a kind of open box where people can be really specific about their identification in a way that is meaningful to them. It'll all be kind of coded in one little box by the statisticians, but it gives people an option to actually say, and I guess review of these kinds of categories will give an idea for subsequent iterations of the standard to work out how more people identify who don't fit into the top 3 there. I don't know, which is an important and valid category, I think, because depending on the age of a person and the experiences that they've had, their orientation mightn't be clear to them at a particular time, and prefer not to answer because some people just don't want to talk about it. I'm now going to contrast this with the sexual orientation questions that we have in our UNSW guide at the moment. Oh, no, I'm not. I beg your pardon. First of all, I'm going to talk to you about the operational definition before I go on to talk about UNSW formulations, which are similar but slightly different to the ABS on that particular point. So these are the words that are coming from the ABS standard, and this is kind of a message to researchers saying that the question's asking about sexual identity and attraction. So it's about the way a person thinks about their sexuality in terms of their romantic or sexual attraction to others. There are a number of other ways that people might define sexual identity and attraction. There are a number of ways, and we've got the most common list here. The question is designed to collect data about self-perceived identity. So it's not about specific detailed sexual behaviour. And of course at the Kirby we are really used to asking people really detailed questions about their sexual behaviour. So if there's an identified need for those kinds of, for getting very, very specific about sexual behaviour, a different set of questions might be more appropriate. So this is not, this is, for example, identifying, for example, as heterosexual, according to the ABS, if I just go back for a second there, you could identify as being heterosexual under this, but then your sexual behaviour might include a lot of sex with people of the same sex, for example, particularly if that were an occupational thing. So, for example, if you identified as a heterosexual man, but you earned your living as a sex worker having sex with other men. So that's a really clear way where you might see behaviour and identity being different. So it's important to recognise that that can be the case, and these sexual orientation questions are just about the way a person perceives their sexual identity. I'm going to just backtrack a little bit to just before the ABS standard was formulated. At UNSW we went through a similar but perhaps slightly shorter process, again talking to our community partners, including the Gender Centre, ACON, the LGBTI Health Alliance, and the Intersex Human Rights Australia, to get some recommended language together. Our answers are very similar to the ones that you see in the standard, but there are some slight differences. So I'm going to show you here how the UNSW recommended one, which you can find in the frequently asked questions for the ethics committee if you're looking for it. So in the UNSW one, we ask, how do you describe your sexuality? And you can see it's slightly different here. Again, we start off with heterosexual or straight. We actually separated lesbian and gay, and we had homosexual as well as gay. And this came from advice from a particular researcher who said that some of the much older gay men that she had worked with actually identified as homosexual. We also put pansexual next to bisexual, and we included queer as an identity. And possibly that may have been to do with a little bias on behalf of myself as one of the people who was compiling this, because being someone who identifies as queer, I really wanted to have it on the list. I'll admit that in the ABS reference group, I did advocate quite strongly to have queer included on their list, but there was a view that some older people found queer to be an offensive term, particularly people who had resided in the UK in say in the 50s and 60s, where it was often used as a term of abuse. And because of that, and because some people had that experience, the ABS kind of opted to be careful and to not use that word. However, I would argue in a university context where we have, for example, a queer collective on campus, and our people who work with LGBTIQ plus students are known as the queer officers, that we've embraced that term. So I like the inclusion of queer. I also recognise and respect the fact that in the ABS standard, they have the I use another term, which enables a person like me to actually tick that box and write in the term that I use, rather than being marginalised or to have to fit myself, for example, into the lesbian category, which I guess would, or into one of the other categories there. So in summing up what we've talked to you about, both Eloise and I consider that the ABS standard is a significant step towards inclusive data collection. It's not the final word in it, but it has come through a really rigorous process of people from the communities and who have representative positions in those community organisations, sitting down and talking about how these questions should be formulated to ensure that trans and gender diverse people are not made invisible, and that people who are living with variations of sex characteristics are not made invisible. And as Ella has explained so eloquently, this is critically important for us to understand the health needs of these populations. That because research is important, as we know, working in a research organisation, it's not just theory floating in the air. The kind of health data that we get feeds into the services and the standards of services that support people to live healthy lives. And if we don't have that data, we do not know what is needed. And I think Eloise made a really important point about young people who are trans and gender diverse ending up in emergency situations because their needs have not been catered for at more primary health levels, and their needs aren't being catered for because we don't understand the size of the population, because we're not asking the right questions. So asking the right questions is critical to moving forward. Now, the ABS standard, if any of you have actually Googled it while we've been talking, and I bet you have, what you'll notice is that it's really confusing to navigate. And that's one of the reasons that we thought it was important in this presentation to kind of present the highlights of, of the questions and how they should look, which are articulated in the standard, but also in the standard you get the coding structures, information about how to do the statistical analysis and things like that can be a little bit overwhelming if you're just writing a survey instrument and you're thinking, okay, so what is the right thing to put in? I would urge you to have a look at it and to make your way through the document, but recognise that can sometimes feel a little bit exhausting, I guess, because there's so much detail in there. We really want to reiterate that at the very beginning of the ABS standard that we're talking about, there is the non-binary sex option is listed, and the reason that is listed is because it is in the 2021 census. So that formulation is actually not approved by intersex communities or by gender and sexuality diverse communities. That has been put in by people who, as far as I can tell, were kind of making it up. And it's going to be confusing. I mean, the results of people who tick the non-binary sex option in the 2021 census, it's going to be very, very hard to interpret. We want to avoid that. So ideally, don't use that. Obviously, some researchers who have to ensure that their research is exactly in line with the next census may end up having to use that. But it is it's a problem that in fact the standard has set out to illuminate and to remove in future iterations of ABS work. So we encourage all researchers to adopt the language, either that's exactly in the standard, or if you want a slightly simplified version, you can actually use the UNSW recommended language, because as I said, we used basically the same process, and overall the structure of our questions is the same, and it has been approved by both our community partners in trans and gender diverse communities, from LGBTI organisations more broadly, and specifically from Intersex Human Rights Australia. And I'm now just going to pop up the links to those. It's a little bit hard to find the UNSW ones, but you go into the frequently asked questions, and then it comes up there when you're in the it's in the research ethics section. So thank you so much, everybody, for your attention thus far. We are now going to be open for questions.
So thanks very much, Eloise and Bridget. That was a very nice walkthrough of the ABS standard in a way that, yes, you're hoping to make it simple enough, but to explain the nuances and the importance, I guess, of each of the elements of those questions. Which and clearly sort of showed the inadequacies of the previous the 2016 used versions. I might just, if I could take the liberty of just perhaps asking a first question, and just wondering what your thoughts might be of how safe people from these communities might feel actually answering the questions. I guess being able to identify and see answers or boxes that they could tick is very encouraging. But do you think also, and perhaps Eloise, I mean, you mentioned the example of somebody presenting in an emergency department and they've got to kind of almost assess their safety before they choose what to reveal. Do you think in a future ABS or other kind of surveys, the communities we've talked about will feel a little more comfortable or be more likely to be forthcoming? Or what's your sort of take on that?
That's a really tough question. I actually don't know. I think what's really important is to create the opportunity for the community to partake and argue to them the importance of the ABS and the institutional integrity of the ABS, and that the purpose of the ABS has always been about capturing small hidden communities that get missed. You know, that's like one of the founding ideas of the ABS. So all of those align with the needs of the community, but it's tough. I think that people, I mean, not to go on, but in 2016, you had, if you were a trans and diverse person, you had to find a number, you had to call up a secret line, you had to be given access to a secret location online where you went and filled out an alternative form. Like that, you know, it was just such an odd kind of, it felt like a bit of a ABS moral panic. Like we need to keep the queers over here and not, you know, polluting the data. But so there's a lot of work is the short answer. Yeah.
And is there I guess a roadmap for dissemination further of this information so that people from the communities are aware, but also policy, you know, others are all aware, because it would seem, yes, that there are, you know, it's that takes a bit of time, I guess, for it to
yeah, it does.
Get into, yeah, and for people then to realise, yes, and that all sort of feeds into the safety, and the more people know and the more people understand this is the standard, this is the right way to be asking, that seems really important part of this.
Yeah, and I think, and just to kind of to not go on too much longer, but I think that it's very difficult for the trans community to separate the idea of an education amendment bill happening here and also an ABS survey happening here, and how, like, of course they are radically different and things, but for the community in general, it's like, I am not going to engage on that level because of the politics, the ABS survey, federal politics, state, international politics. It all kind of ties in with a very kind of traumatised community.
Bridget, did you have anything to add there? Or
I think there is something about when you open a survey, and for me, I've found over the last couple of years, when I open a survey and I see like a two-step gender sex question, I always feel this kind of rush of affection toward whoever has put the survey together. I see that, and I know that they are trying, and I know that they are trying to do and even if they get it sometimes a little bit wonky, particularly that two-step thing, because, you know, researchers at the end of their surveys are always trying to make it shorter. They're always looking for the thing that they can cut out. And I think too often it ends up being something going, well, why are we asking these two questions here? Why don't we just make it the one again like everyone else used to? And so I think, firstly, the important thing is the ABS saying that it should be those two steps. But then for people to actually go, it's just one extra question. And, you know, and it makes a difference. In fact, recently I was filling out a survey that came from researchers in Nigeria, and they had the two-step question. I immediately knew these are people who are, and it was about, you know, MSM stuff, but I knew that they were people who are engaged with issues that are important to our communities and that they are trying to be respectful. And that, I mean, to me, that really, really matters. And I think it's such a great step forward. And conversely, when I see people putting up, like, one of those lists that we had up came from the vaccine booking thing. So if a New South Wales Health booking vaccine, that was the one that enabled you to be an indeterminate sex. Like, what? Who, you know?
Yeah.
Those are people trying without actually doing the work. They're not listening to people. They're not asking. You know, we have these fantastic organisations and we have these resources of people who will tell us that's not the right way to ask the question. What do you think about? What did you think when you saw that one, Ella, with the indeterminate?
Isn't it funny? I saw it, and then I was like, oh yeah, it's another variation of just not working. There's plenty of things to get frustrated about as it is, let alone that. Yeah. It is, the process has always, it's been painstaking. It's been painstakingly slow, and I think it's also worth acknowledging how hard it is to actually come up with a solution, or how hard it has been. I mean, the work needs to be done and it needs to be changed, but there's been, it quickly, when you kind of think it through in your head about how you might go about it, as you often do, you quickly kind of get caught in, you know, in the complexity around the way that people describe their own gender and their lived experience of their own bodies. So the fact that we have, the ABS has been able to find something that is workable is actually, I mean, it's actually quite amazing considering where we were 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, so some great progress, and some dissemination of the standard needs to continue, I guess. Just encouraging anybody who'd like to ask a question through the chat function. We've got one question, Eloise. I think this might be one that perhaps you could provide some information around it. It's anonymous. A person anonymous would like to know what source the figure of the 1,200 people identifying as trans, where that might come from. I think you might have mentioned that in your presentation.
I think it's actually in the ABS's own data. If you jump online and you go into the ABS's kind of entry point and you kind of search in, I always have to admit to being a little bit kind of like slow and not that competent, but that information is, it's a pretty standard kind of response, and I think everyone's a little bit embarrassed about it, including the government, but it's still there. It's as of, I think, recently checked.
Okay, no, thank you.
And I guess that's because people were asking, as you said, it's because in order to be listed as trans and gender diverse, you had to go through this ridiculous process that no one wanted to do.
Yeah.
And so I'm just thinking that this would mean that Denton's survey from 2019 had half of the trans and gender diverse people in Australia in it. I mean, what a coup.
And then if you divided it across the states, and then you kind of like, and then you like kind of those who identify as trans women and those who identify as trans men, and like suddenly you kind of like know, like I know the 6 trans, or, you know, like the 100 trans people in New South Wales who are the allotted number for New South Wales. So it's kooky.
And then another anonymous question, can Bridget please repeat where the 2% figure for intersex people comes from, please? It's all about sources.
That's a really good question. That was actually in an ABC documentary about intersex, and I cannot right now remember the name of it. But if the person wants to email me, I will find it for you and send it to you. So,
and likewise for the 1,263, if people want to know, just email me and I'll find it too.
Great, thank you. This is a question from Philip Keane regarding how the data from the open field, so the please specify options for the variables that you discussed, how have they been coded, categorised and reported in the census or other demographic research? Are there some examples of where you think this has been done well before, apart perhaps from the 2019 Kirby survey? So is that, does that make sense?
It does, yeah. The
Yes.
way that they're coded, it tells you how to code them in the standard, which I haven't got actually open on my computer, and I'm scared that if I try to open it now, something really terrible will happen to the live teams. But they do go through it, and basically from memory, they just go into a bucket together rather than being sorted. But I know that in the Kirby 2019 one that Denton, Teddy, Eloise, many other people were involved in, that they do go right into the different nuances of how people identify, and that has recently been published. And again, Philip, I can send you the details on that. It's been recently published in the last 6 months from that Kirby survey on this. Have I answered that question, or have I missed a part of it, Louise?
No, I think that's addressed it, Bridget. And a question from Steve. I know perhaps your Nigerian example is one example here, but can you provide some details of other contexts in which you think these sorts of questions have started to be asked appropriately, and perhaps some where it really needs to be asked in this way, but not yet, beyond the census, I guess, or is it?
One that totally sticks in my mind, and I saw this at least 18 months ago, was Circus Oz in their evaluation of people who'd been to a Circus Oz show. They had really sophisticated gender identity questions for people, including the 2-step question. And again, it's one of those moments where you go, and it stays with you. So great advertising for Circus Oz, knowing that they did that. So there was that. There was the one that came from a Nigerian colleague of mine. Yes. And again, because it was unexpected, because we know that that's a country that has devastatingly cruel laws toward same-sex sex, that you don't expect to see, careful and nuanced stuff. But of course, many researchers there are very different to the way their legal framework would frame the country, if you like. I can't think of another example, but can you think of one, Eloise, where you've seen the
good examples? I can't off the top of my head. I know that collecting good surveys would be a good hobby.
Yeah, so sort of a measure of how well people are adopting the sort of new thinking.
The other thing I would say is UNSW researchers. I'm on an ethics committee, and I frequently see now people using good as in, you know, adherent gender indicators, and it's really heartening to see. And you also see people who aren't, and who are trying a bit but making it up and blurring it, and that's really frustrating.
So you think sort of the feedback they would don't make it up, go to these sources now that have been well thought through, and input from communities and who know what they're talking about. Yeah. And so Bridget, you touched on the ethics there, and it's funny, the next question is about ethics. And does the HREC, and I'm not sure if this means the UNSW HREC or just generally, actually require, I guess, the UNSW standard to be used? So I guess, would feedback from an ethics committee suggest to a researcher who wasn't using that standard that they should, or that an approval might be held up because, I mean, I'm not sure exactly, but the question is, does your HREC require research to use the UNSW questions?
The low risk one now does send back to people who have not done it, ask them to use this language, and there's been quite a long lead-in period to that. But now the UNSW language has been up on the website for well over a year, and so it feels reasonable. I mean, you never want to be making unreasonable demands on researchers, but once there's been a little bit of time, I think it's fair enough to say, come on, we can do this. It's not that hard.
And I know one of the things that I do at the Gender Centre is I often screen academics coming in with polls, with surveys, with all these kinds of things, and I end up kind of being a little bit of a gatekeeper. Not because I necessarily want to stop them, but if I go through it and I can see that they haven't got the right kind of survey instruments in place, I just say, you're not going to get anyone who's going to do this for you. They will be offended from the word go, and they won't do it. And I know in particular, because the Gender Centre works with a very large cohort of families, and the data collection that is potential or available with those communities, with those families, which is essentially important, continues to fall at the hurdle every time. Because even like in 2021, I've had three surveys come through already, and at each time I've said, I'm sorry, this is not going to cut it with the parents. And they go, okay, well, we haven't got much time, can you just send it through anyway? And I go, yeah, I'll send it through anyway, but it's just not going to cut it, because you haven't done, you don't have that contingency to go back and adapt your instruments towards the community. That's an interesting kind of perspective. Yeah,
no, thanks, Eloise. We've probably got time just for one or two sort of short questions. Cohen from Varcho asks, what about pronouns? I'm not sure specifically with the ABS questions, or is that sort of, that's all the detail in the question, so I'm not sure how that might fit into what you're presenting today. What about pronouns?
They do have advice about the use of gender neutral pronouns in the standard, and I think there was one that I put up where it said I, they, and the they was there for if you're doing an administered survey, and so you're saying, so instead of saying he, she, you use the they pronoun. So gender neutral, and yeah, so it does talk about pronouns in there, and with this idea that you be neutral and inclusive at every possible opportunity, which is lovely.
Very nice. Well, I think we're probably it's 5 to the hour, so we probably reached our end. Had some feedback, a really great session. Thank you both very much, and I'd like to extend my my thanks to you both for your terrific and stimulating presentations, and as you've kindly offered, if anybody had specific questions that they wanted your input on, they could perhaps email you directly with those questions. So thanks again, and yeah, we'll look forward to the new standard disseminating through all our surveys and online forms as we move forward. Thanks very much, Eloise, and thank you, Bridget.
Thanks, Louise.
Thanks everybody for joining. See you next time.